Welcome to Speaking Torah. I'm your host, Rabbi Jessica Lowenthal, spiritual leader of Temple Beth Shalom in Melrose, Massachusetts, and 2019 graduate of Hebrew College. In this podcast, Jewish leaders from around the world read essays from Hebrew College faculty, alumni, and students about how Torah can help us navigate the most pressing issues of our time. Together, we explore the ways Torah can help us approach the world with creativity, healing, and hope. This week, we are pleased to share a discussion between Hebrew College faculty member Rabbi Rachel Adelman and her rabbinical student Risa Dunbar about poetry as Midrash. Midrash, the stories that open our text to even more questioning, along with understanding, is presented beautifully in these offerings. Both writers bring their individual voices and experiences into the conversation with the text, allowing the ancient words a new place in the modern era. Rabbi Rachel Adelman is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible at Hebrew College. She is currently working on a new book, Daughters in Danger, From the Hebrew Bible to Modern Midrash. When she is not writing books, papers, or divrei Torah, it is poetry that flows from her pen. Risa Dunbar is a rabbinical student at Hebrew College. She has worked at Lair House, a new hybrid Beit Midrash/tavern and communal learning space in Cambridge, Massachusetts, BBYO's International Kala program, Camp Ramah in Northern California, the New Israel Fund, and this year is a rabbinic intern at Ohav Shalom in Albany, New York. Rachel's poem, The Luz and the Dew, is inspired by these verses from the Song of Songs. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. When heights are frightening and terrors are in the road, when the almond, Luz, blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and the caper berry crumbles, and man sets off for his eternal abode, and rambling about the market, the mourners abound. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond, Luz, and plain, and peeled the white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. And now, here's Rachel reading her poem.
The Luz and the Dew. This is a poem in 4 parts. 1. A place where a ramp embedded in earth reaches heaven's gate, and angels' knees unbending glide up and down, shock waves along the spinal column. In the time of the judges, a man rebuilds this town, uncovers the hidden gate to eternity. This place is full of lucid old men who would crumble like the dry caperberry if led outside its bounds. They make the sapphire blue dye called tchelet, for only they know the recipe of the angels. Sancheriv could not dissolve the walls of Luz or scramble nations there like old bones in an ossuary. No, they remain integral of one cord. Even the Babylonian army could not raze them to the ground. Some say Luz is the resilient bone just below the cerebellum. Hadrian tries to crush it in a millstone, makes not even a sliver of a crack. When he throws it into the fire pit, not a singe. He sinks it in water for hours, it won't dissolve. He strikes it with a mallet, it doesn't shatter. The source of stem cells. Oncologists siphon its marrow as water from a wellspring underground. 3. Or let Luz be the almond nut or wood. Jacob made striplings from the Luz tree and laid them across a watering trough to speckle or mottle his sheep and goats. 4. I want to live in that town, to suck on that bone, strip the bark of the Luz tree bare, but only dew would soften the dry bones into eternal life. What is my dew? What will waken the dry bone in me, bring me back to life? I look for the dew that wakens the dawn, shakes off the dreadlocks of the night, darkening the palm leaf. It carries the moon's lodestone and gravity's pull. My granddaughter names the wildflowers, lala, green, wed, purple. Field of yellow mustard, poppies and lupines growing rampant in the wild grass, as high as my knee, up to her neck. Her hand in mine, we play I spy with my little eye. She runs up to bend over the petal of something that is purple and pink and traces the darkening corolla inward. Can you say purple and pink, papa and pink? Her laugh would soften any almond nut shell, dissolve any stone in dry ground. I need no dew of dawn to quicken the dead, no loose bone of eternity. The angel of death has no jurisdiction here.
What made you write this poem?
I began this poem at the height of COVID, in the spring of 2020, when, like many, I was housebound under lockdown in Jerusalem. And despite the restrictions, I formed a pod with my daughter and her family. And at the time, I was doing Gan Bubi, that is childcare for my granddaughters, who were about 3 and 1.5 in the morning, so that my daughter could teach high school on Zoom. And I would teach my classes in Hebrew college, the rabbinical school classes in the afternoon and the evening. So it was exhausting and exhilarating, but I was so grateful at that time that I could be here in Israel, there in Israel, through the height of the pandemic, and in contact with that source of vitality of life that these gorgeous little girls had become for me. So around that time, a friend of mine, a teacher and a poet, philosopher, Sarah Friedland Ben Arza, gave a workshop on Zoom on the luz and the tal. Now, tal, the word tal in Hebrew means dew. And according to Midrash, in the end of days, dew will drip down from the locks of the Holy One, blessed be he, to awaken the bones of the dead to life. So that's based on a verse in Song of Songs, where it's described, the head of the beloved is described as wet with dew, his locks dripping with the drops of the night, right? Sheroshi nimlatal kfutzotai rasisei laila. So in that workshop with Sarah Friedland Ben Alza, we explored the biblical and midrashic tradition on the luz, that bone at the top of the spinal column, right up there. I don't know what it's called in English. So it's a source of stem cells that can regenerate bone marrow. And apparently it's indestructible, a source of eternal life. And in the book of Genesis, it's identified as the place where Jacob had his night vision of the angels ascending and descending a ladder. That is Bethel. It's the same Bethel where Jacob says, surely the Lord is in this place and I did not know it. And he said, how awesome in this place. This is none other than the house of God, Beit El. And this is the gate to heaven, Sharei Shamayim. So the Midrash connects this place, luz, with a kind of Shangri-La where no one ever dies. So Sarah Friedland Ben Alza in the workshop posed this beautiful yet simple question. What is the luz for you? What is the source of your intimations of eternal life?
It's so interesting hearing this background because there are instincts that I have reading it, but really sort of getting to understand the reverberations of this idea of bounty in its most endless sense and its most sort of like mythic sense of like the coming of the Mashiach or of sort of a bounty that will be a part of that. And dew being this kind of source of water that is gentle and at the same time, like extremely nourishing. Like, I feel like this poem does that. It is like gentle, and in its right moments, it's hard. Like, the even intonations of the speech pattern or the repetition of a phrase is both gentle to listen to, and you can hear the enunciation and the hard sort of syllables in there. And I think that balance of like the need for structure and the need for sort of gentleness or flow is like very much present both in the actual words and also in the content of this work. And I think I just feel and have such a sense of bounty, like listening to it and also hearing you talk about your grandchildren. Rachel, it's like so beautiful to hear, right? Because it's, for me, like particularly her laugh would soften any almond nutshell, dissolve any stone in dry ground. Like just those two lines, even, it just is so encapsulates the beauty of relationship and the nourishment that we can get from our relationships, and how we witness the way that a particular person in our life affects others around them. And just this attention to sort of not only the sort of double entendre of including almond in there, which also is the word that's used for the almond blossom is like the luz and the reverberations there. But also I think of how almond trees like need a lot of water to grow. Particularly, I'm like from California, and there are a lot of almond trees and they take a lot of water, and like you hear the tal in the almond there in a way that I think is very beautiful. And then it's like direct interaction with sort of the relationship between the wetness or the like richness of the almond nutshell and the water that you know was required to make that, and the dry ground that it's put into contrast with in that immediate next line would dissolve any stone in dry ground. Also the potential of that, right? Like that there is the potential for this to actually be watered and to be full of life in some way. So I think it's just totally gorgeous the way that it holds those forces here. And I also just want to know your granddaughter. Like it makes me want to know your granddaughter.
Why did you decide to write this in 4 parts?
I think about poetry as something that doesn't mean something, but rather in heightened language, it's full of multi-layered allusions. And instead of meaning something, it evokes meaning. It's generative of meaning rather than fixed in what it signifies. It's an associative medium. It's a flowing medium. I like your word, Risa, flow, with rhythm and wordplay. So my inspirations for this kind of genre are people like Tamar Biala, who is the writer and editor of many of the pieces in Dear Shuni, volumes 1 and 2 in Hebrew, and Alicia Ostraker and Elisa Joe Rabbins, who's the rock star of an indie rock band called Girls in Trouble. I feel like I'm mixing two sensibilities, modern existential feminist with classic rabbinic creative commentary. Poetry gives me that freedom.
Risa, do you have thoughts on Rachel's poem?
I think that what Rachel said is like everything. That's definitely how I think about it as well. I think also what is so quite gorgeous about particularly the putting this into steps here, or like movements rather, because I think that actually in Midrashim, like classical Midrashim, it also is movements, right? It's moving you through a particular verse, or it's moving you through a particular narrative or an arc or a way of searching in the text. And I think that what's so gorgeous about this is that it really, you feel the search here. And I think that poetry in its line breaks and in its way of moving you along the page is a form that very much lends itself to doing that searching, both within the meaning realm, but also physically, the way that it is on a page. You're looking for the next word, right? You're moving your eye down or across, or you're noticing what is italicized or what isn't. And the way that it plays, it's playful in that way, using this canvas. And I think that Midrash, in many ways, through its own sort of creative interpretation, is also deeply creative. And it's also playful a lot of the time. A lot of the way that Midrash thinks about making meaning is sort of riffing off of words and turning them into a set of two words instead of one word. And those two words add deeper meaning to that one word, but it's a play on it or something like that. And I think that that is like so clear in this. And you can also just tell, I mean, how incredibly well learned Rachel is in this mode because of the way that it evokes that in the reader without necessarily knowing what the Midrashim themselves are, right? Which is very powerful and difficult thing to do. You have to really know it inside and out.
Risa, I just want to add to that the term Midrash comes from the word lidrosh, which is to seek, to ask, to probe. And that's what the poem is also doing. It's posing questions, possibilities.
Now we'll hear Risa read her two poems, The Fifth Trial, on Hagar conceiving a child, or Save Me from What I Want, and The Sixth Trial, Dear Hagar, a Promise from the Water.
The Fifth Trial, on Hagar conceiving a child, or Save Me from What I Want. Hagar, mistress of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? Genesis 16:8. I did not want you, but she wanted you, and since he betrayed her, I want what she wants. She may have wanted me, and she wanted you, but the way that a spider wants. She did not want you this way, but she did want you. I promise you, she did once. But she did not want what came with you, and she wanted you, and I wanted him, and I wanted you most. And in truth, I did not want you until I had you. But when I had you, I know that you were also you, and you were you, and you I wanted most, more than I could want. You are all I want. And she knew this, and it caught her spider in web she wanted. Why didn't she say, save me from what I want? Abraham said, what I want, I thought would save me. I said, what I did for her, I thought would save me. You said, where have you come from, and where are you going? The Sixth Trial. Dear Hagar, a promise from the water. Genesis 21:10. Rationale. It takes a lot of work to remember we are nothing. What has history given us but a fickle home, a legacy of bloodied men? What's a nation to the sky? Some other wood to call ours, some other snippet of cloud to pretend we own. Fatima Ashkar, How We Left, film treatment. We are bare, burnt body, beautiful, sun-basked on the run. Sweat slips off us like dewdrops on aloe's parched tongue, like a moth runs into firelight, or a cocoon then is unspun. Did I commit crime having you, when I know the world to be a cruel one? I tear myself away to leave you, and yet I gaze there, knowing life is done. Is it because I fought my whole life for a pulse when others whispered numb? I fought my whole life for not even a single grain of sand, not a crumb, You were the greatest of them all, Ishmael, the tenderest yarn into sweater that I spun. I was asked once where I was going, where I was coming from. I turn, a pool so clear, I know it must be a snippet of sky pulled undone, a promise from the water, a mother watching her son who has barely begun.
It's really special to hear you read it, Risa. You make it come alive in your reading. Yeah.
Thank you.
Tell me about why you wrote these poems.
The two that actually we chose to look at today are some of the more fraught ones. And I really think just the whole narrative arc around Hagar is quite a difficult text to read, even just from the literal meanings. And it's very evocative. And also, when I talked about like compassion being in here, I think that you can hear that in both of these poems because I wrote them with Hagar at the center. I did not write them from Avram's point of view. I wrote them with Hagar as the protagonist because I think Hagar is the protagonist in these. And that, quite frankly, I was okay with being more critical of Avram in these moments because I really was angry with him. And I really felt for Hagar and for the pain. That feels like not strong enough of a word. The trauma, really, that she experiences as the maidservant of Sarai and her role, like very deep role in the story of our foreparents, of the Jewish people's foreparents, and the role that her story takes as sort of emblematic of this really this woman who is disempowered and who comes from Egypt and who serves Avram and Sarai and his household and how she conceives a child and what it might have been like to be in that position of triangularity with Sarai and Avram, and also the pain of being banished. And actually, that second poem, I really took quite a lot of influence from, well, as you could see from the text that I quoted by a poet, Fatma Ashgar, who talks about immigration and what that is like, but also from a more modern sort of movement that talks about Hagar and identifies Hagar with the Black experience in America, specifically of a Black mother watching her son, giving birth to a son in a world that is unkind and in a world that targets Black men, young Black men, and maybe what that actually means on like a spiritual level for Black mothers. There's actually a really wonderful podcast from On Being that talks about this. And so I took quite a lot of influence from that as well for the second poem.
In the first poem, the repetition of words, the stuttering, brought up struggle and a feeling of discomfort for me. What was your intention?
I tried so many variations of those words that are the connector words, that are the but and the and the if or in, or and all the variations, of course, of the overuse of you, intentional overuse of the word you. And I think for me, I wanted there to be some sort of a stopping, starting, kind of shifting focus way that the reader would read this. And almost like, okay, well, it seems like there's some meaning that's concealed that I'm about to find out, but it seems like maybe something was skipped over, or I'm not sure what was supposed to be there. And this idea that perhaps she was constantly being put in the middle of something, that Hagar was constantly in the middle of looking one place, looking another, watching herself be watched by someone else, and the ways that that might make someone's focus shift constantly and what the actual effect of that might have been like. That's how you feel reading about her, too. Like, you want her to be treated better. You want her things to be smoother for her. And you just sort of know that, like, when is it going to be smoother?
No, she's wedged, literally wedged
exactly
between, in the conjunction of the and, if, or but, and the you keeps shifting. Right? The you keeps, we're constantly throughout the whole poem, we're thinking, who is the you she's talking to? From the little you, little y of the you, to finally the big Y of the you, meaning thou, oh God, right? She's the first one to whom God speaks, first woman to whom God speaks directly.
Yeah.
So it's quite remarkable. And she's never called a prophetess, yet God speaks to her. Not once, but twice. I want to say, really striking change that you made in the narrative. I'm not sure if it was deliberate, but the angel, she's been banished from the house of Avram and Sarai because she's pregnant, and Sarai is jealous and irked by the fact that she became pregnant so easily. She's banished. Really, actually, she runs away from Sarai's punitive hand, and then an angel appears to her at the site of a well and says to her this question. But the way that it's introduced in the biblical text is the angel of the Lord appeared to her, and he said to her, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Right? Hagar shifrat Sarai emize ba'a ve'ana telechi. So you've changed that in a really interesting way. You called her the mistress of Sarai, not the slave girl of Sarai. And it reminds me of this principle, this rabbinic dictum, that acquire yourself a slave, acquire yourself a master, because you have to treat that slave well enough that he becomes master of you. So you've done this really interesting reversal of roles where she becomes the mistress to Sarai. And she does that by posing the question that Sarai perhaps comes to realize, why didn't she save me from what I want, i.e. she wanted, that is surrogacy, this triangulated relationship. Why didn't she tell me that she didn't want this? Why didn't she save me from what I want? Yeah, and I want to think about that shifting you through the poem, right? So initially it's, I do not want you, but she wanted you, and he betrayed her. I think you're probably referring to the episode in Egypt where he sold her off as his, passed her off as his half sister, his sister, and back in chapter 12. So he's the he, but the you keeps shifting.
Yeah, the first you is her speaking to her son.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Maybe it's the baby in utero.
Yeah, that's what I picture, is this could be a whole internal dialogue, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of her talking to herself.
Yeah. And then it goes, she wanted you and I wanted him, and I want you, capital Y, most. Meaning, I want a relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that God was in each and every poem about Hagar because of how important that relationship is in the text.
Yeah.
As Rachel mentioned, I mean, the relationship there is very clear, and I mean, is it ever clear? But like, it's very much there. It's very present. And the way that Hagar sort of, at least my understanding also of her, a part of Sarai's hatred of Hagar is because of this particular form of relationship to God that Hagar seems to have, either because I mean, the ability to have children is attributed to God classically. And so the way that Sarai may, by actually hating Hagar through this particular mode of having a relationship to God may also be jealous of that relationship in some manner. And I wanted to make sure that that triangulation also was present here.
So initially it's the child and then it's the angel. And it's as if you're having this internal dialogue, and only after this internal dialogue that she's having, only after that, the angel reveals the angel's self and says, "You said, where have you come from?" And it's like that's classic Midrash, right? Achar dvarim ha'ele, right? After these things? What internal dialogue was Abraham having? So here comes Risha and says, well, these are achar hadvarim ha'ele, right? After these things, the angel appeared. Well, what things? She has this internal dialogue, which then prompts, right? So she goes from praying to the child or speaking to the child to speaking, addressing Sarai indirectly, then to a direct relationship with God. Maybe I wanted you after all. And then God says, now she's ready for a direct encounter, and speaks to her. Then the question, where have you come from? Where are you going? Has already in some way, she only answers it by saying, I've run away from Sarai, my mistress. But in this inner dialogue, she's answered that question already. So the question ends. The answer to that question has already been provided in a really beautiful way. I love that you end it that way.
Rachel, what did you think about Risa's poem and the sixth trial?
The sixth trial is in the context of Genesis 21. And this is when Ishmael has already been born, and he's accused of letzachek, of playing or mocking or doing something problematic to Isaac. Although Robert
Alter's favorite translation.
Yeah, right, which is, he was Isaacing, right? He was trying to become the heir. So Sarai banishes Hagar and Ishmael. And you have taken that moment where, again, there's kind of revelation. There's a fear of death. There's an anxiety that they're going to die of thirst in the desert. But you've taken sort of that cusp. Will she be saved? Will there be a moment of faith found in this barren land bereft of water, right? And you have spun, I'm going to use that word, that's your word. You have spun.
It's a favorite verb of mine.
It is a gorgeous, gorgeous poem with a beautiful rhythm and stunning similes. I love the dewdrop on aloe, the moth to firelight unspun cocoon, and I'm thinking about, what is that image, right? Something I did not ask for, I did not want, and yet I'm drawn to that light. So why am I singed? Why am I burned? Asks Hagar, right? Drawn to that which will harm me. And so instead of turning from the caterpillar to butterfly, she's actually stuck in an unspun cocoon and wondering, what is this for? It's really a dire existential moment evoked by your similes. And she invokes a question, right? She asks, did I commit a crime? Having you when I know the world to be a cruel one? And she asks another question. Is it because I fought my whole life for a pulse when others whispered numb, right? I was looking for life. I was in search of life. Am I being punished for that search of life? And then you use this other gorgeous simile. I fought my whole life, not for a single grain of sand. So that's being juxtaposed to the promise to Abraham, where he's told in the Akedah, and the covenant is being reinvoked. And right, God tells Abraham, I will make your seed or offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky or dust of the earth. And you said, I don't want any of that, right? Hagar says, I don't want the promise of the stars of the sky or the dust of the earth or the sands of the seashore, right? She's pushing back against that covenantal promise, against God's.
And that's what Fatima Asghar also says in What's a Nation to the Sky? Some other wood to call ours, some other snippet of cloud to pretend we own, right?
Yeah.
Because all of these similes of these ways that God promises a particular kind of future to Avram is via these metaphors and these similes of sands of the earth and stars of the sky.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess for Fatima, it's they're ephemeral, right? These promises are ephemeral. They're like clouds. So she's rejected that. She's rejected the covenant with the patriarchs and divine promise. And instead, what you do is you do this beautiful movement where you move to the domestic, the maternal desire for a child, where Yishmael then becomes the tenderest yarn into sweater that I spun. Beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And then she becomes watchful over the child with an intimate domestic gaze. She's a snippet of sky pulled down, like undone. It's a promise of water. It's a mother watching her son barely begun. And then I have the image of the spring. It's a spring that wells up within her. That's her source of faith. That sort of hope in that child.
I felt so drawn to that, to the water, particularly because that's actually absent from those two images of the divine promise or of those two images of the Brit. And that actually there's this other thing that is so life-giving and so full, and actually the thing she needs. And it's exactly what she finds. And it's withdrawing consent from this other thing. It's not just that it's what she needs, but it's in it being the thing she needs, she also is somehow withdrawing consent from this other paradigm that has oppressed her.
Yeah,
right?
So it's water versus sand, right?
It's almost water versus sand in this kind of strange and like, and also, I mean, the moth running into firelight is also about sort of a hearkening to the fourth of perhaps, though you could argue, like, water, fire, air, that's a whole sort of paradigm. But I think that specifically the water is supposed to evoke that as an opposition to, and almost perhaps more desirable in its own kind of way, to the sand.
I've always read chapter 21 not as Abraham's trial, but as Hagar's. This is Hagar's binding of Ishmael, a kind of binding of Ishmael, like Abraham's binding of Yitzchak, Akedat Yitzchak. And I wonder how a woman experiences trial in this way differently, like how Hagar experiences trial differently than how Abraham's 10 trials are, let's say, divinely induced, right? God says, Lech lecha, go forth from your land. God says, sacrifice your son. God says, circumcise yourself. And I wonder about the way that a woman experiences trials differently, right? Chapter 21 is her trial. What's her trial?
I think it has felt very important to use the poetic form to explore her relationship to the trauma or the pain of this moment, particularly because I wonder about what is it that for her was hard. Was it she left or she was told to leave, but is it actually, does she wish for it back, or is this actually is this actually better for her? And like, what kind of psychological experience would it be like to admit that perhaps this was better than what she was subjected to in Avram and Sarai's household, which I think is a possible reading. And perhaps the trial is the actual psychological experience of having to admit when something we have endured, that the thing that we were more afraid of is actually the thing that's better. Particularly in a disenfranchised situation where you really have either slavery or the harshness of the desert, which is really the situation that she's in here. And it's sort of in a moment where those are really the only things that are available to you. Like, what I find so unbelievable about her as a character is just her sheer ability to be at all, right? Even just that is just an absolute miracle when those are the options. So I think for me, I'm still left with just this sense of deep wonder and awe at this model of this character that we have and what it asks us to think about when we see injustice in our lives and injustice in the world and injustice in our communities, perhaps even where we feel triangulated in some way. I think it's a really important call for us.
Can I read the poem back to you, Risa? The sixth trial, Dear Hagar, Promise from the Water. I think the listeners would appreciate that. And I think it's also important for the poet to hear it in a different voice. Padraig O Tuoma always ends by rereading the piece, and then it comes to light in a new way. So I'm going to read this back to you. We are bare, burnt body beautiful, sun basked, on the run, sweat slips off us like dewdrops on aloe's parched tongue. Like a moth runs into firelight, or a cocoon that is unspun. Did I commit crime, having you when I knew the world to be a cruel one? I tear myself away to leave you, and yet I gaze there, knowing life is done. Is it because I fought my whole life for a pulse, when others whispered numb? I fought my whole life for not even a single grain of sand, not a crumb. You were the greatest of them all, Ishmael, the tenderest yarn into sweater that I spun. I was once asked where I was going, where I was coming from. I turn a pool so clear, I know it must be a snippet of sky pulled undone. A promise from the water, a mother washing her son who is barely begun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Speaking Torah. We want to thank Emily Hoadley for our logo and Hebrew College Rabbinical Student and composer Jackson Mercer for our theme music, Essa Einai. To learn more about Hebrew College, please visit hebrewcollege.edu/podcast. And remember to subscribe, like, and rate Speaking Torah wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll leave you this week with Hashkivenu, performed by Hebrew College grad cantor Kevin Margolis and the Torah Synagogue's house band, the Panorama Jazz Band. You can listen to the full album on Spotify by visiting our website. I'm your host, Rabbi Jessica Lowenthal. Thank you for joining us on Speaking Torah.